So in this perspective of the Garden of Eden, you start with the premise that everything that happens from the beginning of creation up until now and until the end of creation is God's will. So there's no mistakes in God's universe. Nothing happens outside of the divine will. So going back to the Garden of Eden, if we look at the Garden of Eden as a sort of model for how creation began, however we want to interpret that, and obviously I'm not meaning in some sort of literal sense, but I'm not meaning either in some sort of purely imaginary sense. I'm meaning that this is very much the nature of the human condition now, and very much the nature of the way God's laws work. So if you start with the premise that everything that happens is God's will, and you have Adam and Eve, and they're living in the Garden of Eden, and everything is one, at that point, everything is happening as God's will. You have Adam and Eve eating the apple, being fooled into eating the apple, and separating from God. And you would also have to see that as God's will. So the fall of man in that situation would be God's will as well. And Adam and Eve, after having eaten the apple, they believe, wow, we have really messed up. We've really gone against God's will. We are humiliated. We've caused all of mankind to fall. This is horrible. We're naked. Let's cover ourselves. Let's cover up. Just the shame of what we've done. This is horrendous. And they think that they have separated from God. They think that they have gone against God's will. But again, everything that happens is God's will, so they actually have not gone against God's will. But that belief in their own self-will, their belief in their so-called rebellion, their belief in their so-called separation, which is really just the illusion of separation, the illusion of self-will, that is actually what causes the time-space, cause and effect, linear narrative of our lives, the narrative of life as it unfolds. And the sense of separation is time and space that Adam and Eve have believed that they created. So in a sense, when you have non-dual teachings, you have mystical teachings that say, well, time and space is an illusion. Yes, it is an illusion because it never really separated from God, the timeless and the formless. Yet in believing we have separated, and yet in Adam and Eve believing that there has been this separation, that they have acted on their own free will, we have inherited that from them. And we too believe in time and space. We too believe that we have free will and we are choosing and controlling the events of our lives. So just like they were victims, or not victims, but they were basically in the belief that of something that wasn't real. They were believing that they had used free will, and yet they really hadn't. And just like them, we too do the same. And that's recapitulated in each individual's life. As we grow up and we develop, we get conditioned, and within us arises this sense of a self, this sense of a self-will, this sense of I am in charge of my own destiny. I am responsible for my own choices. I can control my own actions. All that arises in us, just as it arose in Adam and Eve. And yet, It's just a belief we have. It's a belief in something that's not real, because the entire time only God's will is happening. But what does happen with us believing in this sense of free will, with us believing in this sense of separation, what does happen is a lot of suffering. And in the Christian tradition, all of this suffering is called original sin. And that's at the base of it. So original sin was Adam and Eve actually believing that they had used their own free will, when in fact they never really had. It was God's will for all of this to happen. And so in the Christian tradition, when you have redemption, and you have redemption by the grace of the cross, and you will hear even very, very traditional pastors talk about Christ as having died for past, present, and future sins. And if we look at sin as the illusion of free will. So Christ has died to remove that illusion from us, and that grace is afforded to all, past, present, and future. And so it is that grace that removes the original sin. It is that grace from the cross that removes the illusion of free will. So in a sense, it's not our own free will doing it. It's again God's will. God's will, just as it was God's will that this kind of illusory fall happened, it is also God's will to remove the illusory fall when that happens in individuals. And the removal of that illusory fall could be called, enlightenment in a sense. Obviously, most people don't have that complete sense of separation and free will, belief in free will eradicated completely. But this is the general idea of what's going on here. And then you could also ask, well, okay, so let's just back up here. If everything that happens is God's will, then why does God let people suffer in the world? And from this perspective, suffering by definition is the manifestation of time space. So God basically could not have created the universe without some sense of suffering, or to more accurately put it, we wouldn't have the sense of this kind of time, space, and cause and effect were it not for some sort of suffering. And the root of all that suffering is free will, or the illusion of free will, the illusion of the personal doer, the illusion of the personal self. All of those illusions are, in a sense, what creates this linear aspect of time and space. I mean, and without any of that, you would be back into the timeless and the formless. You would be back into God in a sort of unmanifest form as pure consciousness, and you wouldn't even have the creation. So, the question of why does God allow suffering in the world? Well, there would be no world without suffering, in a sense, because that suffering is based on the idea of the separation. So, anyways, that's a mouthful of words and concepts, but you could also check out, I've got some of the general principles written down on my blog that there's a link to on my YouTube page if you just kind of want to check that out. And obviously I'm not just on some sort of philosophical kick here or some sort of theological kick. I mean, the point of seeing all this is to facilitate a direct experience with God, to clear up our misunderstandings so that we are more aligned towards the experience of God and the experience of peace in the here and now all the time. It's not necessarily an intellectual thing or a theological thing or a doctrinal thing. So anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.